In our course of events, as we now move towards an opening, the differential quality of consciousness has a peculiar tone to it. The tone is one of a mixture of nostalgia for the nature, the integral mode, for the tribal values, for the comfortable stories which we fit into. And this produces a sense of feeling tone which is akin to what we would identify as nostalgia. It's not quite nostalgia, but it's a tone of missing something, and part of the quality of missing it, this semi-nostalgia, haunts the quality of consciousness at this particular stage. When we try to think about ourselves in this mode, the emotional identification that comes up is loneliness. And because the quality of loneliness has a deeper sense of oblivion to the ego than even death. Loneliness is a quality which the ego cannot fight, whereas it can fight or flee from death, or even come to accept death through some kind of ideational encouragement. The ego cannot accept loneliness. Loneliness is a quality which comes up as a lack of form, a lack of definition, a lack of place. And this lack of form, this lack of definition, lack of place, is very similar to, different from, as we will see, but very similar to the sources of anxiety. In one of his brilliant ideas, Freud, in several places in his writing, makes it clear that anxiety does not come from repression. It's a popular misconception by those who don't read, by those who don't think about what they read, by those who don't understand that repression causes anxiety, and so to get rid of repression then gets rid of anxiety. This is not the case at all. Anxiety comes up from lack of definition, lack of form. In a sociological sense, one would say from a lack of identification, from a nebulousness that one cannot get a hold of because there's nothing to get a hold of. And so the ego experiences even the beginnings, even the tinging beginnings of loneliness as a threat to it, which exceeds even the threat supposedly of death or of injury. And it's exactly at this point that the greatest lure for regression occurs. And so in our course, in our education, the more that we go into the education at this point, the more we need to be conscious of the fact that these qualities are there, these processes occur, these challenges come forth because of what we're doing. And if you experience them in your life in a way which is a little uncomfortable, try to become aware, try to become conscious of the fact that what we're doing here is in fact encouraging this particular aspect to come front and center. Now, there are many presentations of this in the development of civilization, while there are almost no presentations of it in terms of cultural initiations. In cultural contexts, in tribal situations, where myth is the basic relational quality of life, where mythic language has its sequences, its storylines, which include us. It is the storylines that get us through. And so the forms of the myths are like protective envelopes that keep us from experiencing some of these challenges. But when we have interiorized meaning to a point to where our own realization, our own individual capacity to understand begins to exceed that of the tribal level, exceed that of the culture, we become more and more what I think the most beautiful presentation of it was a book, the very first book that Colin Wilson ever wrote. He was about 19 years old when he wrote it, called The Outsider. And it was a young Englishman trying to understand what a writer like Albert Camus had written in The Stranger. That as we gain in deepening perspective for ourselves, as our feelings become more refined, too refined to any longer fit in the storylines, our penetrative insight becomes too sharp to stay within the bubbles of the tribe. Our own symbolic qualities begin to exceed those of the culture. The experience is that one becomes a stranger to that. One becomes alienated from that. One becomes an outsider in terms of that. And this quality, this alienation, this being outside, this being a stranger, has a double appeal initially. And the double appeal are versions of the fight or flight situation. The fight situation turns into deeper introspection. One finds oneself gaining pleasure at just being alone, at being alone, at starting to think about things. One goes off by oneself to think things through, think things over. One learns to enjoy meditation. One learns to enjoy contemplation. One turns to prayer. All of these are what we would call symbolic, metaphorical states of the fight quality of facing a challenge. The flight quality is that one begins enjoying roving. You might be able to read Kerouac's On the Road 7 or 8 times and then get up and go. Find yourself doing something absurd like hitchhiking. Although I think the times of hitchhiking on Route 66 were very pleasurable, when you see some of the 20-lane modern freeways like I-5, how are you going to hitchhike? You have to be Terminator 3 to get out there. This flight quality gives us a chance to want to explore this unknown land and go into new areas, new realms. Both the meditative and the on-the-road qualities are metaphors, symbolic metaphor states for the fight or flight confrontation with this challenge. Whereas if the challenge is natural, there are always images of it which can be finally come to. If it's a natural challenge, there are images for it. Every instinct comes up with images. Every primordial quality of feeling is capable of imaginative focus. When we were doing the ritual section of the course a year ago, exactly a year ago, we were making masks. We were putting faces on some basic feeling that we recognized in ourselves. We were putting a second mask on some basic food from our diet. Some food or drink, something that we take in, something from our diet. We're putting a mask, a face on it. And we were making this pair of masks, a mask of food and a mask of feeling. And the whole ritual section of this education, which followed the beginning nature section, was concerned with this pair of masks. Not the ideational mask of comedy and tragedy. Not that mask. That's a conscious differentiation. But something even more primordial, which is food and feeling. Deeper than comedy and tragedy, food and feeling. And the faces of food and feeling, even in their mask quality, yield a polarity which creates a dynamic. And this dynamic is the origin of drama. It is this dynamic which is the origin of drama. It is only later on, in a differential mode, when one is conscious, when one is dealing with art, that comedy and tragedy occur for the first time. There was no comic drama worthy of the name before Aristophanes. There was no comic drama which one could point to a particular characterization, like the clouds, with Socrates coming down in a basket being lowered from the ceiling, and all the students wondering what he's bringing down this time in terms of questions and excitement and looniness. Before Aeschylus, there was no tragedy. There were great dramas, great ritual dramas, like the Triumph of Horus in ancient Egypt. But they were not tragic. They were not comic. Those more primordial dramas are filled, instead of the tragedy or the comedy, they are centered on mystery. And so the very earliest undifferentiated quality, which comes from the very origins of vision, are dramatic plays of mystery. And it's only later in art that this visionary mystery drama gains its double attractor quality of comedy and tragedy, so that one could then have, for the first time, the masks of comedy and tragedy. But our two masks did not come from that differential universe where there's comedy and tragedy, where there's mystery. But before that differential mode is this whole ecology of nature. And at the objective base, at the existential foundation of that natural ecology, was the experience of food and feeling. And we put masks to them. And we found that the urge to ceremony came when those two masks were brought together. And the closer they were brought together, their proximity forced a space to ignite. And as they were brought together, and that space, that proximity increased and the space decreased, there was a pressure, and out of that pressure came the motive for language. The spark to say something, to express something, not oneself, but the pressure of food and feeling being brought together, their proximity. That space has a natural amphitheater of a dynamic which includes motion, as in dance, and language, as in chant. And we saw that in this way, the mythic realm opened itself up from a condensation in ritual, opened itself up again to become like a second flowering of nature. And in a way, myth is a representation of nature. Myth represents nature in just this way. And we saw that as nature was condensed by ritual activity, myth is condensed by symbolic activity. And just as ritual existence gives form to nature, symbolic forms give a presentational quality to language, to myth. And that culture, which exists here in the mythic sphere, fitting in with nature, parallel to nature, becomes for the first time in its symbolic condensation squeezed again, new proximities. And it's there, exactly there, that the first qualities of alienation, the first qualities of being an outsider, the first intimations of being a stranger occur. And so, very often, in a meditative experience, in a contemplative focus, in a prayer situation, one experiences in a natural way this challenge. But one is still within nature. One is still a child of the universe. And there are universal currents, patterns, which carry us through. Carry us through to a point of realization. Carry us through to a focus of realization. Carry us through to a vanishing point of integration. A vanishing which is characterized by acceptance, by absorption. And out of that acceptance, out of that absorption, out of that vanishing, flames the gift of consciousness, the beginnings of vision, the mystery of return. And out of that mystery of return is generated again, only this time with conscious dimension. And the masks now are like comedy and tragedy. The qualities now are, instead of being ensconced in a story, one is responsible for telling the story. One has become the storyteller. And rather than audience, one now must be writer. One must be speaker. One must learn to create. And instead of imagination being enough for us, we now need something called memory. We need to remember. We need to have a sense where the qualities of arithmetic that used to be okay, the adding and subtracting, the multiplying and dividing, those arithmetical qualities now need to be done in a different way, a new way. And instead of arithmetical qualities, we need mathematical qualities. Instead of adding and subtracting things, instead of multiplying, dividing things, we now need to have complex relationalities. We need to have proportions. So instead of just looking to see, we now need a sense of perspective to compose how we see. Instead of adding and subtracting, we need to have ratios. Instead of multiplying and dividing, we need to have functions and probabilities, vectors and their tensors. We need a mathematic rather than an arithmetic quality. Whereas in nature, mimesis, the imitation, the representation, the paralleling and the analoguing by representation, the use of images to help us to select and integrate the world are no longer enough. Those qualities now need to be transformed. And so art is remarkably different from myth and directly different from ritual. And so when the challenge of being outside, of being a stranger, of being alienated, comes again, a second time, in this particular realm of art, the challenge now is staggering. And the temptation is to slip back to where it was solved before. The invitation to regress is highest exactly at this point. And so every artist experiences at this particular juncture, it's an actual juncture, experiences those deep feelings to either fight or flight, to think deeper or to go farther, to get lost in doing, or to get absorbed in praying. And neither of those activities is going to satisfy the challenge. Now, one of the qualities that makes our spiritual species triumphant is a quality which was explored and enumerated by many individuals. I think for myself, the first time I ever understood it completely was spending a week with Arnold Toynbee in San Francisco. He was at the PBS channel KQED for a week, and he was doing a series of interviews. And just sitting and being with him and his interesting wife. Interesting because she was not an international glamour person, but she was a very nice little English housewife with a little hat and a little purse and a polka dot dress. And this was the woman that shared the life of the greatest historian of the 20th century, who could be so incredibly imposing. He was a tall, broad-boned man, pale blue eyes like Paul Newman's eyes. And there were times when he spoke with such consciousness and authority and comprehensiveness that one was absolutely astounded. And then later he would say, I hope I didn't speak too strongly. Forgive me if I did. And you were shaking in your boots while you were shaking his hand. And Toynbee said that one of the most fundamental qualities of conscious life is that we must have a response that is exacting to the challenge. Challenge and response. Whatever the challenge is, the response needs to be in similar kind. Now, the challenge of the person is not met by a response on the mythic level. You will see in the lecture circuits and the bookstores and the psychology clubs, the psychology non-clubs and the non-psychology non-clubs, all about personal mythologies saving you. Don't you believe it? It doesn't happen. The mythic response is thoroughly operative in nature. It doesn't function at all in consciousness. There's no traction. Why? Because a story is meant in an integral mode to give you a storyline, whereas consciousness is a differential function, and it loves to unravel. It doesn't want to come together. It wants to undo. And so one finds the great comic lines like Henry Fielding and Tom Jones, beautifully quoted in the film with Albert Finney. Off they rush to London, one by one, some to undo, others to be undone. Life in the big city is a differential stew. Life in the London of feelings time is like life in our Los Angeles, or life in Plotinus's Alexandria, or life in Moliere's Paris. It's a differential stew, and the responses of integration are not sufficient to meet the challenges of differentiation. And yet, there has to be some form, otherwise there's anxiety without limit. And anxiety without limit, we use the German form Angst, because it becomes so profound as to be absolutely daunting. One can get caught in a complete limbo. And the exact opposite of a mystery is the catatonic limbo. Aldous Huxley once wisely, from his tall bird-like perch of standing up with his head craned, said the neurotic drowns in the very water that the mystic swims. They both experience this differential stew. They experience this third ocean, not the ocean of nature, not the ocean of myth, but the ocean of vision. And to navigate the ocean of vision, one needs to have a form which is mobile, and that form is the person. The person is mobile. Now, when this problem of trying to understand the necessity of personal mobility became an absolute crunch necessity. In the Germany of the late 1920s, there were a number of individuals at that time who addressed themselves seriously. Let's look with the wide eyes of Athena's owl at this. Let's understand this. And so you had individuals trying to wake up out of myth consciously, trying to be in it consciously, to like have conscious dreams in that mythic structure, and then consciously wake up and consciously look around to see what was there. And so you would have an individual like Thomas Mann, who would write the great mythic novel Joseph and His Brothers, ensconce us again in this great myth, this Egyptian Hebraic myth of Joseph and his brothers, the origins of the 12 tribes, the origins of the whole motive for there to be an exodus. And right after Joseph and his brothers, the novel about trying to wake up the magic mountain. Hans Castorp, who goes into the mountains for a cure, expecting to be there to visit over a weekend, finds that he also has the disease. And instead of a weekend, he spends 7 years. And instead of observing other sick people, he goes through the illness himself. But the most difficult thing could not be done in Germany. The writing of the facing of the challenge of vision by the conscious mobile person was not available in the Germany of those days. And in order to write that novel, Thomas Mann had to come to a place where it was possible to do so. And the place he came to was Los Angeles. and he wrote Dr. Faustus here in Los Angeles. Living in nice, comfortable sunlight in Pacific Palisades, and writing one of the most fearsome conscious novels ever written, Dr. Faustus. About a Nietzschean composer trying to come to out of the nightmare of myth, out of the haunted fearsomeness of transformation, into some kind of formed semblance of a world which will unravel forever. How does one become a person? And we can see now that the integrated individual is remarkably different from the viable person. And to miss that distinction is to invite a regression completely. Now, there were many other individuals at that time who were trying to come to this, trying to wake up out of this. One of the writers in Germany at that time, a man named Bruch, Hermann Bruch, wrote a sequel to Virgil's Aeneid. Because somehow in Virgil, one finds something that one does not find in Homer or any other author before Virgil. Virgil is the very first author in the entire history of this particular planet. Granted, on other planets, on other star systems, there are other Virgils. But on this particular planet, there's only one Virgil. And his Aeneid is a conscious epic. Not like Homer, who dealt with the qualities of the origins of tragedy and the origins of comedy. Not ha-ha comedy, but comedy in the sense that life is able to survive and flourish. And the Odyssey is the epic of that. A divine commedia. And the epic of tragedy is the Iliad. But the Aeneid is an epic of mystery. It goes deeper. It's a conscious epic. It goes deeper than the Iliad or the Odyssey. The Aeneid goes to one of the most uncanny qualities, completely unimaginable, and that is one faces consciously a return to that visionary realm which verges upon disappearing into incomprehensibility. This is a section in the Aeneid, which we're reading now. Those of you who are taking the course, we have a synthesizing text that helps us all through a year. And there are a pair of them, because we take everything in pairs. One of them is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The other is Virgil's Aeneid. Those who are following the synthesizing thread of the Aeneid, this is what you're reading this week, which is the most precarious experience in the whole Aeneid, which goes with this particular tone now, where alienation, where being an outsider, where being a stranger, occurs most poignantly. Not just because of the society that's unraveling that we live in. Not just because of the paucity of cultural qualities and values that we all experience. And not just because of our own personal lives and development. But in a concerted way, this education is verging us on this threshold in a designed, compositional way. Here's how Virgil gives us a symbolic artistic expression of coming to terms with that primordialness which is unrelentingly mysterious and which sucks us back into nothingness unless we learn to swim in face of its current. Here's how it is in the translation of Alan Mandelbaum, the University of California Press edition of the Aeneid. Virgil has been told the only way that he can find a place to come home to is to create that place himself, and that the only way that he can come to that vision of where it is and how to do it is to interview the Sibyl of Cumae, the most fearsome woman of the ancient world. And so he comes face to face with the Sibyl of Cumae. Cumae is just north of Naples, an actual place. The Sibyl was an actual phenomenon. And they excavated about 40 years ago the Sibyl's cave, and the tunnel leading to the cave had a series of odd-shaped, key-shaped windows on one side. And as the tunnel went deeper and deeper into the earth, the light from these key-shaped windows dimmed, and the reflections produced a peculiar cacophony, as if one were going down the barrel of a gun into some oblivion that was certainly there. And as one came to that point of the oblivion, suddenly the underground chamber opened so that there were more than 100 passages where every sound echoed into cacophony, and the slightest sound became a rain of falsity. And in the midst of that comes the Sibyl of Cumae, this old prophetic woman who is completely lost in a frenetic vision, and only by his giving form to the language and holding that form in face of all this cacophony and madness can Virgil extract an answer that he can use to navigate and create a home. Here's how Virgil writes it at the beginning. Book 6, line 60. The giant flank of that Euboean crag has been dug into a cave. 100 broad ways lead to that place, 100 gates. As many voices rush from these, the Sibyl's replies. Just as the Trojans reached the threshold, the virgin cried, "Now call upon the fates for oracles. The God is here, the God. As she says this before the doors, her face and color alter. Suddenly, her hair is disarrayed, her breast heaves, and her wild heart swells with frenzy. She is taller now. Her voice is more than human, for the power of God is closing in. He breathes upon her. And are you slow to offer vows and prayers, Trojan Aeneas? Are you slow? She shouts. This terrifying house will never open its giant jaws before your vows are spoken. The Sibyl spoke and then was still. The Trojans' tough bones were shaken by chill shuddering. Their king now pours prayers from his deepest breast. And he goes into a long, instinctual litany to Apollo. And as he does so, slowly, the conscious Aeneas wakes up in the midst of this welter of "Protect me, Apollo." In the midst of that litany, in the midst of that mythic response to this existential challenge, the consciousness of Aeneas begins to take over the navigation, and instead of there being just a response to terror, There's the beginning of an interrogation to get an answer that's necessary for navigation. The mythic response will save your life. But you've saved your life simply to be adrift on a new ocean that you don't even know where you are, much less how to go, much less even imagine where to go. You save your life long enough to drown completely conscious. And so the navigating response, which the person uses, is remarkably different from the response of myth. Art is the absolute necessary minimum of navigating the ocean of vision. The artist as a hero, most honorably in ancient times, like Aeneas, was the true king. The king makes the kingdom. Not in the mythic sense of the king being a designation from divinity to rule temporarily over some realm which is maintained by ritual, but a king of the self who is able to establish a home, a formed shape in the midst of a differential torrent. And this quality is remarkably necessary and different. One of our textbooks, out of the pair of textbooks now, Stravinsky's Poetics of Music, paired with Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man, Stravinsky, on page 24 of the English translation, says this: "Thus I take cognizance of the existence of elemental, natural sounds, the raw materials of music, which, pleasing in themselves, may caress the ear and give us a pleasure that may be quite complete. But over and beyond this passive enjoyment, we shall discover music. Music that will make us participate actively in the working of a mind that orders, gives life, and creates. For at the root of all creation, one discovers an appetite that is not an appetite for the fruits of this earth." It's not only every artist worth his salt understands this, but every artist that is worth his mercury and his transformation understands this also. In the progression of metals that leads to gold, all of the stages that make the transmutations are keyed and cued by minerals. You have to know what minerals to use at what keys for what cues to make the transmutation process happen. But in order to make it apply to you, the transmutation process is not enough. You have to have it in a transformational configuration. Because the only way to include you in that whole progression to gold, even if you know the intervals of the minerals and their cues and their timeliness, it's not going to apply to you unless by transformation you include yourself in that process. It becomes yours, your process. And the gold becomes you, your gold. And your gold is not a metal. It's a transformation out of the metal sequence into the spiritual sequence. And that spiritual sequence opens up. It doesn't gain molecular weight. It opens up like a shower of cosmic rays. And if you're looking for a fleck of gold, if you're looking for a nugget of gold, you're never going to realize that it's the open-ended shower of cosmic rays that is now the proper place for you to be. The spiritual person is at home in that kind of flow. Someone who doesn't know that, who isn't really that, flees immediately back to the last stage of safety, which is usually some ritual comportment. And they take up chanting. Only on this level, it's a regression and it's radioactive. Instead of the chants coming out of nature, they come out of fearfulness. And if they work at all, the save me, save me, save me becomes gimme, gimme, gimme. Let's take a break. Okay, there we are. This is a very good photograph of Henry Moore. And I have 42 slides to try and just acquaint you with Henry Moore. So just bear with going through the slides in rather quick order. And I will leave the slides on the carousel, and we can take a look at them again next week. This is, notice Henry Moore sitting in his own garden, much Haddam, England. Notice the hands. Moore lived to be, I think, 88 or 89. Let's go to the next slide. This is Henry Moore with his wife. You can see that he lived a very simple, basic way. He was raised in one of those mid-England industrial towns and went to trade tech and was really mechanical in his qualities. And so his lady, just very basic English earth lady. Next slide. This is Moore when he was young, and one of his themes that he worked with was the scared fragility which needs a protection on the outside. That on the inside is this scared fragility because of facing dangers, and so one needed to have a protection, like a gladiatorial mask on the outside. Next slide. This quality of protectiveness he associated with the mother, and eventually expanded that to include women. And his expansion of the protectiveness of women took two forms at the same time. One was massive, bulky women, like Paleolithic earth mothers, huge, enormous, that they can protect. And the other are women who are capable of opening themselves to transcendental spaces. Here is one of his most likable sculptures. It's a Madonna and a child. Let's see the next slide. This whole quality of the mother holding the child and protecting the child became then an artistic theme which he began to develop in a vector that led towards abstraction. Why abstraction? Because he was trying to develop the resonances, the implications, the differential geometry of this relationship. So next slide. So this is an early Henry Moore showing mother and child. Notice now that the blending of the two bodies together gives rise to what were called at that time holes, the holes in Henry Moore's sculptures. Places of penetration, places of acceptance. Next slide. Here's a further abstraction. In other words, the progression is not for integration, but for differentiation, and abstraction moves into further differentials, higher abstractions. Here, the central space, the nest space, is where the child not only can be or will be, but where the child is. Next slide. Now you can notice in the studio sculpture a different configuration from the one that was in the cathedral. Much closer to this kind of fragile figure within the protectiveness. But as we will see, one of the guarantees of the protectiveness is the willingness to let space develop. And so the next slide. So here's the mother and the child, again, in this tandem, emphasized by the rocking chair, the mobility, and a lot of space. A lot of space because there's a linkage here. The arms are linked, the feet and the thighs are linked, and the rocking chair, its motion links them. And so one has this whole series of interlockingness. And so one of the themes in the 1930s that Moore developed was the interlocking, linking qualities that related to spatial acceptance. And so interlocking forms are paradoxically also indicative of spaces, and spaces indicative in a complementary fashion of interlockingness of forms. Next slide. So here you see the interlocking, and you see the spaces, and you see the beginning here in the womb. It's a pregnant woman. She's ready to protect this form and also to give it space at the same time. Notice the paradox. Notice that transformation involves paradox. What in the integral mode is irony, in the differential mode is paradox. Okay, next slide. Here are two forms. Now he's taking it to a great abstraction. Mother and child, abstracted, protection and space, and interlinkingness, all of these themes now operating. And Moore later will take this particular configuration to almost cosmological ends. We'll see towards the end of the slideshow. Okay, next. All right, now he focuses upon not the child in the helmet, but the woman also has a fragile interior and needs a protective shell. She needs to have this bulky body to protect and preserve what is really a very fragile, almost stick-like quality, almost a skeletal quality. So the skeleton in the bulk. Next slide. Here's just the bulk with space, just space there. The dissolving of structure into space, leaving the other complement, the bulky volume, to carry the entire meaning and protect it. Next slide. Here the protection is the admission of space into the form. The sculptured form itself, by having lots of spaces, those spaces are now protective. Not protective as in pushing away, but protective as an accepting to the nth degree. Incorporating whatever is going to come into that space into the acceptance of the sculpture. Next slide. And he became more and more concerned with this repetition. It's almost like an arrowhead. It's like the repetition of the forms and the spaces together penetrates through the danger zone, penetrates through the alienation. Next slide. So the reclining woman became a great theme. Notice the version of the protective helmet that we saw maybe 20 years before, is now in the torso of the reclining woman. And these great ledges of thigh, allowing for almost a natural strata kind of a quality. And here this polished wood, you can see, I believe it's olive wood with that grain. Notice the repetition, the head and the torso, the helmet structure again. So that the ledge space here is 1, 2, 3, is a differential quality of space that there is in the head form, there is in the torso form, down here is in the legs, the thigh. Next slide. Halfway, 45 degrees from reclining or from standing, sitting. Next slide. Here's a sitting sculpture where the huge bulk, he wrote in one of his books that at this particular time he wanted bulk as much as you could have. He was interested. It was like a Paleolithic earth woman. He wanted to explore that. Next slide. And about that time, the Second World War broke out, and that meant in London, where he was, bomb shelters, and people having to live in bomb shelters, and largely what was useful to them was blankets to wrap themselves up to wait the cold nights through the air raids. And a lot of Henry Moore's sketches came at this time. He didn't have material or time to make sculptures so much, so he sketched, and his sketchbooks are filled with these Henry Moore mummies, people wrapped, and still exploring the reclining figure here in this particular page. Next slide. And for the first time, he begins exploring the paired couple, wrapped together, sitting together. For the first time, instead of just mother and child, one finds now man and woman, wrapped together. Next slide. He began working in his studio with some presentation of the man and woman sitting together. Not a single reclining figure, but a paired sitting figures. To try and get this angle of vision. Because both men and women, suffering from the same anxiety, plunged into the same dissolving acid situation. Next slide. And so this little maquette figure, he called these little figures, he worked with maquettes. They were hand size, hand held, because he realized that the palm of the hand was the first table for sculpture. The first forms of writing were clay, cuneiform tablets that fit the palm of the hand. The first cylinders were fit the closed hand, so that the first forms of writing fit in the palm of the hand. Written language begins in the palm of the hand. So Moore's sculptures begin with these maquettes that fit in the palm of the hand, you can work with. And he would work with these 4 or 5 inch sculptures like this, and then he would project it out. His sense of differential proportion, next slide please, where these figures now began to take shape almost of a size of life size, 6-foot figures. Then he projected, because he was experimenting with the sense of broadcasting out this message of protection by togetherness and by space and by wholes, and by bulk and relationality. Next slide, please. So he made a huge sitting. King and queen were put outside in the countryside. For the very first time, Moore realized that the art was not just for the individual person, not just for the gallery viewer, but that this art, this quality of meaning, this differential geometry of proportional understanding needs to be put in nature, in the world at large. And so Moore became interested finally in making sculpture that would appeal to the entire world outside. Let's put our art on the planet. Let's do that. Next slide. And so the later Henry Moore, instead of dealing with just maquettes and castings that would be in foundries for galleries, that sort of thing, became interested finally in exploring, well, how did the classic great sculptors, the sculptors, say, of the Renaissance, how did they work? Where did they go? And of course, the greatest sculptor of the Renaissance was Michelangelo. And Michelangelo got his marble from Carrara, a mountain in northern Italy. And so here's Henry Moore, going back to Michelangelo's source, back to Carrara. Next slide. To try and think through, to try and feel through, to try and vision through what 500 years ago had been achieved in the Renaissance and what he was trying to align himself with and achieve in the 20th century. That while it was very difficult to wake up from the Middle Ages in the Renaissance, it's almost impossible to wake up from our medieval regressions into a 20th century Renaissance person. Very difficult. So here's the sequence of Moore, great world-class artists, struggling with the materials of his art on a new scale. The next slide. Trying to not only use his hand as the proportion, but his whole self, the golden mean, his entire body, the quality of the person as a measuring index for the relational expression and proportion of the sculpture. Next slide. And so you can see the size of the blocks that Moore is starting to work with, and ever larger blocks, ever larger. Next slide. The laying on of the hands. The artist is not superstitious, but is penetrative, knows the forms are in the material already. It's a relationship between artist and material that allows for the work of art to come out. One has to get to know one's material, accept it. It's a part of you. And when you work with it, the material flows through you. And in a complementary fashion, as the material's grain goes, so you go that way too. Next slide. Here he is working with this beautiful Carrara marble, starting to make sculptures that were settings in the fronts of large, huge, impersonal 20th century buildings. The office skyscraper in the international style, steel cages 50 stories high. How do you make a work of art to hold its own against this challenge? This challenge of impersonability. How do you bring the values of art into the marketplace where you have 50-story steel cage buildings? Moore solved that problem. One of the greatest artists of all time. Next slide. This particular sculpture is called The Archer. He made it for the Civic Center in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Toronto, wanting to be a great, huge, world-class city, made civic center buildings that were arched and curving about 70 stories high in a pair. And how are you going to have a work of art to hold up with that? Moore made it. Next slide, please. And it was so successful that he began making copies, larger and larger copies of some of these forms and sending them all over the world. All right, they're going to build steel cages in 15 countries. I'm going to make sculptures for every one of them. Next slide, please. Also, he was exploring this quality of the forms together. And notice now, for the very first time, he begins exploring triads. 3 forms together. All right, here are standing women, the 3 graces. Next slide. And as you move around and through them, as they're larger than life, one gains these interesting perspectives, and one begins to find almost cliff-like qualities, sculptured, flowing cliffs of art, canyons of perspective, thinking it through, feeling it through, the artist coming to terms and grip with a planetary nightmare and giving a response in like kind. Next slide. And so in front of some of these buildings, like this UN building in Paris, which had this incredibly impersonal concrete pleating, sort of a neo-Le Corbusier style, Moore brings this pretzel quality of the reclining nude and sets it in front. And of course, it holds its own, more than holds its own. Next slide. He begins making these convoluted forms, larger and larger, more and more powerful, to go into plazas that will not only be a response to a single building, but a whole complex of buildings. Let's have 7 or 8 impersonal skyscrapers, and right in the center, Moore will put the campfire of consciousness, a work of art that's a nude. Next slide. And so here at Lincoln Center in New York City, surrounded by canyons of buildings, Moore now introduces the reflecting pool to double the size of an already monumental mother and child. Working with 45 times 2, working with 90-foot qualities of sculpture. Incredible response. Conscious artist, planetary response. Next slide. Thinking it through, working it through, feeling it through. Next slide. Stonehenges of consciousness in the midst of urban jungles. Next slide, please. Yeah. There's the map. Because the conscious artist can stare down the nightmare of the 20th century, hands down. We're ready for the 21st century, easy. Okay, into the slideshow, and we'll come back to the lectures. Take a couple. One of the atoms of hydrogen is missing on this molecule. You didn't know that, did you? Remember this pair? The challenge and the response? Or is it this way? The challenge and the response. This is a molecule of alcohol. This is a molecule of aspirin. Notice the paradox? They're made out of the same thing. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Paradox. Masks, transformation, and paradox. The origins of drama in ancient Greece. The author says, without doubt, the most problematic evidence in any attempt to sort out the complex relationship between the dramatic festivals and the numerous other forms of masked behavior is the difficult testimony of Aristotle concerning the origins of tragedy and comedy. The question as to Aristotle's accuracy is not answered simply by checking what he said against the available facts. The difficulty is complicated by our lack of a clear idea as to how we should interpret the testimony itself. Much of the modern world has forgotten a great deal. Consciousness has to remember. Consciousness functions better when it remembers. In nature, you don't have to remember because nature remembers. Nature records the instincts, the archetypes, the images, the actions. Once something is done, it's karmically there forever. So smile while you can. But in a differential field, you have to remember. Nature cannot record that and keep track. Consciousness has to do that. It can work with nature. They can make a relationship. Nature is like a mother, and we're like a child, but as we grow, the space, the distance increases. It has to. And so as consciousness becomes more differentially available to its own intelligences, to its own qualities, to forms which fit its challenges, to responses that characterize our qualities, we become more distant from strangers too, if we are not careful, alienated from, if we're not attentive, outsiders, if we're not perspicacious. We can keep that relationality, but that relationality now is complex. It's full of ratios, it's full of proportions, it's full of functions, it's full of probabilities. It's full of trigonometric relations, and a simple plane geometry is not going to do. It does not matter how dependable those geometric forms were, how dependable those diagrammatic relationships were. They are no longer responses that are applicable to the quality of the challenges that actually occur. In one of our films that we use, Forbidden Planet, and they're shooting 1 billion electron volts at this mysterious creature materializing in the beams of the electron flows. And later, the captain says, well, it went away. And the first mate says, hopefully, well, we took care of it. He said, no, it went away. It'll be back. And he asked the doc, he says, how can this be? We should have vaporized it. Anything dense enough to absorb 1 billion electron volts would be so dense it would have sunk to the planet's core of its own weight. He says the only other option is that it was renewing its atomic structure microsecond by microsecond as we destroyed it. Something more powerful than the densest matter a conscious mind that creates and recreates and recreates. And if it is anesthetized, if it's asleep, then we get in bright neon marquee lights, Goya's phrase, the sleep of reason produces monsters. Then you get things that are really scary. You can't build a spear big enough to gut that kind of a creature. It doesn't matter how much courage you have. It doesn't matter how much hunting companionship you have. You're outclassed because it's a challenge that our whole orders higher in power. And the old responses are not sufficient. You're going to be outclassed, outdistanced every time. And most of the nightmares, most of the monsters in the 20th century are monstrous forms of anxiety that come out of a process that's even beyond art. That process known as history. In order to deal with the challenges of history, one has to be minimally a conscious person. Minimally. And that's just getting you to the threshold where you can begin to deal with what's really there. And if you have fled for whatever reason, how did Gilbert Roland used to say it? Hey, my friend, it doesn't matter how simpatico you are, eh? It's going to get you. So wake the fuck up. He didn't say it that way. It was a nice Catholic boy. One has to come to a responsiveness that is going to be able to gain parity with the challenge. The challenges are already there. We came into a situation, we were born into a century that already had enough monsters to keep things busy, and they've grown a great deal since. The good news is that the response is available, but that there's so much work to be done. A handful of people, 10,000 conscious people, 100,000 conscious people, not going to be able to do it alone. Roll your sleeves up as you will, there's just not enough people. The response has to be hundreds of millions of people, men and women, who roll up their sleeves together and deal with it. That can be done. But there's not any way to even begin to get traction until there's an education that makes hundreds of millions of people available for this kind of accepting that challenge. There's no elite, no matter how technological they are, that have any traction whatsoever to the intractable problems that are already loose on the planet. There's no fascism so cool that it's going to be able to do anything except just be swept aside. It's like ice age proportions of time if we don't consciously deal with it. An ice age of stupidity and regression and radioactive terror, which we don't need to have at all. With the right response, a challenge becomes absorbed in a process that initially is a mystery and then develops into a civilization structure. This is where we are. And so in the early part of the 20th century, the artists were the heroes. When one writes a monograph on an artist's a major artist of that time period now, like this monograph on Picasso. Its title is Reordering the Universe. Picasso and Anarchism, 1897 to 1914. Notice before the First World War. The artist like a prophet, understanding ahead of time the juices in a great world-class artist like Picasso or Kandinsky or Henry Moore are working well ahead of the historical phases of development. While one would see pristine portraits of Edwardian England in the novels of Henry James, behind that were late 20th century concerns with the anxieties of cosmological proportions haunting those persons, also there in Henry James. So that the photographs of Henry James in London of 1910 show a dapper gentleman. Inside is someone dealing already with the arcane, abstruse qualities that are there in Daisy Miller, Turn of the Screw, The Golden Bowl. No one was more sensitive to occult London than Henry James. But instead of being haunted by it and turning to some kind of fictive, mythic presentation or representation of it, Henry James dealt with it in terms of consciousness. So to a Picasso at the same time, Picasso dealing with it. So one finds a phrase like this in the study, Reordering the Universe. So familiar now is this personally revelatory artist, so confident are we of finding in his works those cues and signposts of his life, that the Cubist period seems to have been authored by another Picasso, one who, though he may be the most brilliant formal inventor of the century, is sublimely indifferent to content. This disinterested Picasso, however, was largely his own after-the-fact invention. That the paradox of the feint of disinterest is a form of conscious protection. One of the greatest disguises of all time is the disguise of disinterest. Just before Sanjuro goes into a battle, he's busy yawning about nothing at all. And the next frame, the sword is out, flashing. The paradox of the instant mobility of the brilliant kinetic quality of response being shielded by disinterest. The disinterest is a responsive mode to the challenge of dissolved form, of nebulosity. One feints this disinterest, or a form of disinterest known as anonymity. My anonymity is simply a responsive disguise to this time. Maintained for 30 years, who cares? The response is in like kind to the challenge. So if the challenge wants to bring it to a head, the response will come to a head also, because they're annealed. That protective form includes space. Space is a protected form, and the disinterest is a form of that kind of emotional space. This quality in our education is brought out, is focused now by Henry Moore and by Frank Lloyd Wright. The spaces in Henry Moore's sculpture have a like quality of the spaces in Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. And we're going to take a look next week at Wright's architecture, at the reality of space, because a human being who is free to inhabit the space of a structure is a conscious person. Wright said that the box as a form of the house was the basic seed out of which fascist tyrannies are born. Because you can turn out tens of millions of boxes that are all the same, and it will tend to configure tens of millions of people all the same, so you can use the same propaganda phrase 10 million times by having it uttered again and again over one radio station, the only one broadcasting. But if you destroy the box as a form for human habitation and open it up to the differential possibilities and complexities that are there in spatial relationalities that flow and interpenetrate, it's very difficult for a tyranny to come up because that population doesn't support it. They're not fodder for it. They're not automatic endorsers of it. They're not subconscious stooges. That kind of population is a democracy. Whereas the other kind of population, Wright coined a phrase. He called it mobocracy. He did a series of lectures at Princeton. Genius and the mobocracy. That there needs to be an architecture of freedom. And that one comes up with something like an organic architecture, a natural house, a living city. And that a civilization of the future needs living cities to express itself. And that there is no way whatsoever that cities as they stand are ever going to express any civilization. They express only in their current form. An overwhelming glacial mud towards regression. And the longer they go on, the more gangs, the more aggressive tribal level, the more, not repression, but diffusion that creates anxiety. Anxiety is created by diffusion, says Freud, not by repression. And when you integrate diffusion, when you integrate that anxiety that comes out of diffusion, you get panic. And that hairline trigger for a whole cacophony of phobias is what the Sibyl is shouting at the modern person now. And if you can't keep your language formed, you're truly going to be lost in face of that. We don't need to be caught in those undercurrents, those rip tides of instinct. We have every single capacity to swim. And like the Southern California surf hobo, you know that sometimes if a wave catches you and you can't get to shore and the undercurrent and the undertow is too much, just swim parallel to shore for a little while. You'll hit a spot, then you can go into the beach. You have to be able to defer the need to get to safety until a strategic time when you can just get to safety. It not only saves a life, it saves everybody all the time on very large levels. There's no way to get to shore in the 1990s. Not one single way. And the 21st century will start out by just patiently swimming parallel to whatever shore is going to be there. But early enough in the 21st century to be interesting, there'll come some spots where we can get ashore. Part of the dealing of this course is to make sure that the paradox is firmly grasped in a form, but a form which is a prism instead of a box. That prism, that prismatic form is the person. And so art has always been about the person. Now, when we come to one of our textbooks, like Erich Neumann's The Archetypal World of Henry Moore, we have to read this with circumspection. This book originally was in the Bulligan series, published in 1959. I bought a copy in Chicago in 1959. This is it, on State Street. Neumann was a Jungian psychiatrist who practiced in Tel Aviv. He had gone through the crunch of the Second World War, of the Holocaust. He understood Jung even better than Jung in some specific ways. The specific way is that Erich Neumann understood the massive archetypal structure of the feminine better than Jung. In fact, Erich Neumann is world famous for his great book, A Monograph on the Archetype of the Great Mother. It's still in print after 50 years. Princeton University Press paperbacks. And the archetypal fairy tale that leads out of the mythic impasse of the archetype, because the Great Mother archetype is always an impasse for consciousness. She's always a protective envelope for you on the tribal level, but when you have transformed and grown out of the tribal level, she's no longer a protection. Then she's like the cave of the Sibyl, filled with a labyrinth of possibilities that is truly daunting. The fairy tale that leads to freedom out of that, Erich Neumann wrote a book on that too, called Amor and Psyche. Chapter 15 from a great Hermetic novel written about 1900 years ago by Apuleius. The Transformations of Apuleius. Along with Ovid writing The Transformations, based on mythography. Apuleius, being a high savant, hierophant in the Hermetic mysteries, wrote of the transformations of consciousness. Ovid's metamorphoses are the metamorphoses in transmutation on the mythic level of the gods, whereas Apuleius's transformations, his metamorphosis, is of the individual in consciousness. And at the end of that is this complicated, scintillating fairy tale of Amor and Psyche. The mystery of love. Before it's a tragedy or a comedy, love is a mystery. And Erich Neumann wrote the best commentary on Apuleius ever written. Nobody in the ancient world understood Apuleius as well as Erich Neumann. And he says one of the difficulties in the 20th century vis-a-vis psychology and art is that the person is misconstrued such that we don't understand that there are great currents of archetypal symbol that flow differentially through the person. And if you just take the person in a reductive, natural way as an individual, you miss all of that. And instead of your ship being able to navigate the oceans of vision, you're sunk by the storms in vision instantly. Because by taking a small, definite view of the person as an individual, me, you get an ego mask which doesn't hold up to the winds of anything, much less to the hot breath of the dragon. Erich Neumann begins his study with just this sentence, and I think we'll just begin here and then let it be and come back next week. One constantly hears the objection that psychological art criticism begins, besides reducing the work of art to the personal psychology of the artist, is at most capable of grasping its material content, but is by nature unable to discuss the principle of form that constitutes the real essence of art and of artistic creation. Notice here that there's an equal quality of reductive as well as creative capacity that instantly is there on that threshold, where vision begins to precipitate art right at that median, right at that liminality, at the beginnings of artistic form, at the beginning of the precipitation of the person, is this paradoxical precariousness that you cannot tell at that instant whether you're reducing something down reductively and beginning a regression, or you're creating and beginning to have an expression artistically. The only guides, the only silver threads in those storm clouds at that period are fairy tales. And fairy tales are like conscious models of ways to proceed through that electrostatic threshold where vision begins to be art. One of the very first qualities in fairy tales are that in fairy tales, animals can speak. And one begins to be able to talk to the animals and the plants, and to learn secrets that were hidden in nature and now are able to be divulged supernaturally. And one understands that one is no longer in nature, but in the supernatural. One is in consciousness. This is the threshold. And even in Paleolithic art, some 25,000 years ago, at the beginnings of art, one finds that the images of the animals are cinched together into a composition by the handprint of the artist. It was the first symbol ever used to cinch a composition of animals into a vision, a visionary mural, so that one today can speak very truthfully of walking into the gallery of Lascaux, because all of the images there are not just images, but they make a composition, which is the direct forerunner of the gallery of the Sistine Chapel and places like that. The whole cosmos is there given an artistic symbolic form. Just being able to do this 25,000 years ago doesn't automatically mean that everybody ever after inherits that. No one inherits that because the genetic structure is not in nature for that. You inherit that through civilization. Civilization has to give that genetic structure. And the function in civilization that does that is education. And that's what this is all about. And if this doesn't function, those genes, those supernatural chromosomes do not get transmitted. And what you get then are regressive mutations very quickly. We know from history, East and West, because it's happened several times, that if the transmission is interrupted for one complete generation and not corrected, it is not established again for several hundred years. The civilization of Islam has been frozen since the 14th century. The civilization of Western Europe was frozen for about 700 years. China got frozen twice in its history. It got frozen out of science from 1430 to about 1930, about 500 years. So it happens not infrequently. We have lost a complete generation who do not understand the civilization. In fact, it's been almost 2 generations now. So it's getting a little precarious. All you need to do is take a film of, say, 60 years ago, any film, and just pay attention to the sociological web, the background, the texture of interpersonal relationalities. And see that film just before seeing any film of 1995. Any film. The difference between Dinner at 8 and Forrest Gump is catastrophic. Next week we'll talk some more about possible solution, and that's what this education is for.